The crystal goblet rested upon the mahogany table, gleaming coldly under the dim chandelier light. Julian Vance had fallen silent forever during that lavish midnight feast, his final breath stolen by a silent, calculated poison. Welcome to Swasti Diaries. Tonight, we re-examine the elite countryside wellness retreat, where luxury masked a labyrinth of betrayal and hidden debt. Detective Arthur Sterling stood inside the opulent dining hall, gazing down at the silent remains of the meal, knowing that every single guest seated at this very table harbored a profound reason to wish Julian dead. But the forensic analysis revealed an immediate, chilling contradiction. The lethal dose had not originated from Julian's personal wine decanter. It was systematically swapped, designed for someone entirely different, turning an act of murder into a high-stakes game of deadly misdirection. As Detective Sterling meticulously pieced together the fragments of that fateful evening, a darker truth began to surface. Julian Vance was not merely a wealthy guest seeking tranquility. He was a ruthless blackmailer holding the financial ruin of everyone in this room in his palm. Yet, someone at the table had outsmarted him at his own game. The question that haunted the investigation from its earliest hours was not simply who poured the venom, but how the intended target managed to redirect the lethal cup back onto the blackmailer before the midnight hour struck. Julian Vance always carried an old, half-chewed peppermint candy in his left coat pocket, a nervous habit he never broke even when sitting among the wealthiest elites of the country. That small human detail remained behind in his silent hotel room, untouched while his lifeless form grew cold in the grand dining hall. Behind the polished walnut paneling and the towering French windows of the retreat, a deeper rot had taken root long before that midnight feast. The guests who gathered around the mahogany table did not come for peace or wellness. They arrived because Julian summoned them with quiet ultimatums, dangling the threat of total financial destruction over their heads. Detective Arthur Sterling understood that this was not a spontaneous crime of passion. It was an execution disguised as an accident, orchestrated with chilling precision inside a sanctuary designed to keep the outside world away. The unlisted wine glass sitting near the head of the banquet table held the answer. It contained a heavy sedative mixed into a vintage Julian never drank, confirming that someone at the table anticipated his moves and redirected the poison back toward him. Yet, as the perimeter security logs showed no outside entries, the circle of suspicion narrowed entirely to the 4 survivors sitting just feet away from the tragedy. If the lethal glass was meant for a different guest, the question remained: who among them possessed the cunning to swap the goblets in plain sight without leaving a single fingerprint behind? The air inside the grand dining hall hung thick with the scent of melted wax and spilt Cabernet, trapped beneath the vaulted timber ceiling. Detective Arthur Sterling surveyed the banquet arrangement with calculated precision. The polished mahogany surface mirrored the soft, amber glow of brass wall sconces, casting long, wavering shadows across the empty seats. Julian Vance sat slumped backward in the high-backed velvet armchair at the head of the table, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. To the casual observer, he merely appeared asleep after an exhausting evening of heavy dining. But a closer inspection of the table setting shattered that illusion entirely. The silver cutlery before him remained neatly aligned, untouched by hands in panic, while his crystal wine goblet lay tipped over on its side. A dark, jagged pool of vintage red liquid had soaked deep into the white linen runner, dripping rhythmically onto the polished parquet floor below. There were no signs of a physical struggle, no shattered plates, and no frantic footfalls disturbed the dust along the baseboards. The poison had done its work quietly, neutralizing its target without disturbing the opulent symmetry of the room. Yet, resting precisely 3 inches to the left of Julian's empty plate sat the unlisted wine glass, the unmistakable anomaly that dismantled the illusion of a natural passing. The glass retained a residue of a sedative compound completely absent from the other decanters on the table. It was a silent testament to a swap executed with absolute calm. As Sterling examined the tiny droplet clinging to the rim of that foreign glass, a disturbing reality took shape. The lethal dose was never meant for the man at the head of the table. Someone had intercepted the drink, shifting the cup in plain sight while the candles flickered and the room remained entirely silent. Detective Arthur Sterling traced the origin of that unlisted wine glass far beyond the banquet table, straight down into the cold subterranean cellars of the retreat. The vintage residing within the crystal bowl did not match any bottle poured during the feast. It belonged to an exclusive private reserve, logged exclusively under the founder's personal inventory. This single discrepancy dismantled the initial theory of a random mishap. Someone had accessed the secure cellar racks, selected a bottle laced with a heavy, fast-acting sedative, and substituted the glassware with absolute precision. Yet, the cellar log showed no digital keycard usage during the critical hours of the midnight gathering. The physical access relied on an override code known only to a select few. Sterling examined the heavy wooden racks where the private reserves rested in the dark. One bottle stub lay discarded in a corner slot, its label partially torn away, bearing microscopic traces of the same sedative compound found at the banquet table. The physical evidence pointed toward deliberate preparation, executed long before the first guest stepped into the dining hall. But the presence of that poison vintage raised an even more unsettling question about the mechanics of the crime. If the lethal dose was smuggled into the cellar and brought up to the dining hall without triggering security alerts, how did the perpetrator manage the swap right under the noses of everyone present? The trail led away from the cellar stairs and back toward the shadowed corridors of the main floor, where every suspect maintained a carefully rehearsed alibi. Sterling knew that someone was concealing a massive risk, a risk so severe that murdering the blackmailer was the only viable escape. The laboratory report arrived on Detective Arthur Sterling's desk at 3 in the morning, carrying a revelation that dismantled every initial assumption about the midnight feast. The chemical breakdown of the sedative extracted from the unlisted wine goblet did not match the standard dosage required to neutralize an average adult male of Julian Vance's physical build. It was calibrated for a much lower body mass, engineered to induce immediate unconsciousness within minutes without triggering a violent reaction. This singular toxicological discrepancy shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Julian Vance was not the intended victim of that poisoned cup. The lethal draft was meticulously calculated for someone else entirely, someone sitting at that very banquet table whose biological profile matched the precise thresholds of the administered sedative. As Sterling reviewed the seating arrangement against the forensic charts, a darker pattern emerged. The poison had been swapped not to eliminate the blackmailer, but because the real target anticipated an attack and deftly redirected the lethal glass toward Julian's place setting before the candles burned down. Yet, this clever redirection left a gaping void in the chronology of the night. If the intended target managed to switch the cups right under the noses of everyone present, where did that leave the blackmailer's hidden corporate ledger? The physical ledger containing the financial ruin of every guest had vanished from Julian's private suite before the forensic team secured the perimeter. Someone had slipped into the room during the chaos of the midnight meal, prioritizing the recovery of those incriminating documents above all else. Detective Arthur Sterling closed the toxicological file and turned his analytical gaze toward the living inhabitants of the retreat. The elimination of Julian Vance as the intended target recast every surviving guest under a harsh, unforgiving light. Two names immediately dominated the investigative board, each possessing an overwhelming motive to silence the blackmailer permanently. The first was Marcus Thorne, a brilliant but disgraced financier whose entire corporate empire hung by a thread. Marcus had received a final, devastating ultimatum from Julian just 48 hours before the feast, demanding a ruinous financial transfer under the threat of public exposure. Marcus sat in his private suite throughout the midnight hour, claiming he never left his quarters, yet his heavy wool coat bore microscopic traces of the exact sedative found in the unlisted wine glass. Across the hall lay the second primary suspect, Clara Sterling, who operated under a meticulously crafted alias. Clara harbored a deeply personal vendetta, having tracked Julian to the retreat to recover stolen family assets stripped away by the blackmailer's ruthless corporate maneuvers. Her alibi for the critical window between 11 and midnight dissolved entirely when security logs exposed her unauthorized presence near the service corridor connecting directly to the kitchen. Both individuals had the means, both possessed an unyielding motive, and both stood on the precipice of utter destruction if Julian's hidden ledger ever saw the light of day. Yet, as Sterling weighed their conflicting statements against the physical evidence, a subtle contradiction emerged regarding the precise moment the glassware was switched. Neither Marcus nor Clara could explain how the poison vintage found its way onto the table without triggering the internal alarms. The digital logs provided by the retreat founders crumbled under the weight of physical reality. Detective Arthur Sterling stared at the enhanced perimeter security footage displayed on the portable terminal. The glowing screen captured a stark contradiction that shattered every prepared alibi. While the founders maintained that the entire perimeter remained locked down during the midnight hour, the infrared camera pointed toward the western service corridor revealed a silent, unauthorized movement. Someone had slipped out of the kitchen annex at precisely 11:40, moving with practiced stealth along the shadowed stone wall. This movement directly overlapped with the critical window when the wine glasses were swapped inside the grand dining hall. Yet, the identity of the shadowy figure remained obscured by the deep architectural overhang, leaving only a faint trail of physical evidence behind. A narrow strip of melted candle wax and a single displaced paving stone marked the path of the unseen intruder. Sterling realized that the investigation had moved past simple suspicion into a dangerous game of exposure. The person caught on that security loop was not just hiding a financial secret. They were actively engineering a cover-up. But as the digital clock ticked toward the pre-dawn hours, a much larger question pressed upon the detective's mind. If the security system was robust enough to track a single footstep along the exterior wall, how had the missing corporate ledger vanished from Julian Vance's private suite without triggering a single internal alarm? The digital perimeter logs provided by the retreat founders crumbled the moment Detective Arthur Sterling cross-referenced the physical access registers with the night custodian's handwritten delivery records. The accepted timeline regarding the security footage was entirely appended. The infrared camera framing the western service corridor had not captured an unauthorized intruder sneaking out during the midnight hour at all. That movement belonged to the maintenance supervisor performing routine frost drain checks, an activity fully accounted for and verified by independent mechanical sensors. The digital shadow that had seemed so damning in the flickering monitor glow dissolved under closer inspection, proving that the real vulnerability of the retreat lay not in perimeter breaches, but inside the locked administrative core. A heavy mahogany door in the ground floor management office stood slightly ajar, its brass lock cylinder cleanly picked from within rather than forced from the outside. Inside that secluded sanctuary, resting beneath a stack of blank stationery, lay the missing puzzle piece that shifted the entire dynamic of the investigation. It was the hidden management ledger, its leather binding worn from years of tracking illicit financial transactions and corporate embezzlement. The pages inside meticulously documented every covert debt Julian Vance held over the attendees, transforming the midnight feast from a random act of malice into a desperate defense mechanism. Yet, as Sterling turned the heavy ledger pages under the steady beam of a brass desk lamp, a chilling discrepancy emerged. The financial trails pointed directly to massive capital drains, but the final entry, dated mere hours before the feast, contained a handwritten annotation in Julian's own ink. Someone had discovered the ledger before the murder and meticulously altered the asset distribution list, setting up a dead man's switch that would trigger the moment his heart stopped beating. The pages of the hidden management ledger revealed a deeper, more unsettling conspiracy than mere corporate embezzlement. Detective Arthur Sterling traced the entries back nearly 2 decades, uncovering an intricate web of systematic financial ruin orchestrated by Julian Vance against the founding families of the elite retreat. The Midnight Feast was never a genuine wellness gathering or a celebratory reunion. It was engineered by Elena Rostova as a calculated confrontation arena, a controlled environment designed to force Julian into a corner where he could be stripped of his blackmail leverage once and for all. Every guest seated at that long mahogany table shared a dark, common history rooted in a past corporate collapse that Julian had ruthlessly exploited for personal gain. Yet, the presence of the unlisted wine glass indicated that someone at the table did not just want to confront the blackmailer. They intended to permanently silence him before he could expose their compromised past to the public. As Sterling analyzed the final annotations in Julian's own handwriting, a sharp realization settled over the silent room. The dead man's switch encoded within the ledger's final pages meant that Julian's death would automatically trigger the immediate release of encrypted files to international regulatory authorities. The person who swapped the goblets had inadvertently signed their own doom, ensuring that escaping the retreat with clean hands was now an absolute mathematical impossibility. For a brief, deceptive moment, the investigation seemed to reach a definitive and satisfying conclusion. Detective Arthur Sterling focused his attention squarely upon the retreat's head chef, whose fingerprints were recovered in abundance on the exterior of the poisoned wine decanter. The physical evidence pointed toward a clear and understandable workplace grievance, transforming the complex conspiracy into a straightforward crime of opportunity. The chef possessed unhindered access to the kitchens, understood the pantry inventory, and had ample reason to resent the high-pressure environment fostered by Julian Vance. Interrogators quickly moved to assemble the arrest files, convinced that the puzzle of the midnight feast was finally solved. Yet, this tidy narrative collapsed entirely under a rigorous forensic timeline reconstruction. Automated pantry sensor logs established beyond any doubt that the chef was physically bolted inside the dry storage walk-in freezer from 11:15 until past midnight due to a faulty latch mechanism. He could not possibly have poured the sedative or swapped the goblets during the critical window of the crime. The case was violently blown wide open once again, returning the investigation to the terrifying realization that the true mastermind remained seated among the elite survivors, entirely unmasked and untouchable. The laboratory report did not arrive with a dramatic flourish, but rather as a quiet document resting on Detective Arthur Sterling's wooden desk at 4 in the morning. Yet, its contents shifted the entire architecture of the investigation. Tucked beneath the left fingernail of Julian Vance lay a microscopic trace of material, a single gossamer-thin cashmere fiber of an exceptionally rare weave. This was not generic textile shedding. It matched a bespoke, custom-dyed wrap commissioned exclusively for one individual residing at the retreat. When Sterling cross-referenced the microscopic fiber against the digital keycard audit logs for the private residential wings, a chilling geometric certainty emerged. The timestamps of access did not merely suggest a possibility, they placed that exact suspect in Julian's private suite during the precise minute of contamination. The physical evidence bypassed every alibi, dissolving the elaborate web of manufactured innocence that had shielded the primary suspects throughout the night. Someone had engaged in a direct, tactile confrontation with the blackmailer before the poison took full effect, leaving behind a silent signature on the victim's hand. As the detective traced the ownership of the rare cashmere weave back to its source, the remaining protective barriers crumbled away. But even as the identity of the physical confronter came to light, the mechanics of the glass swap remained a complex puzzle demanding final resolution. The textile fragment proved a violent physical encounter, yet the question of how the deadly draft crossed the crowded room without raising an alarm hung heavily in the cooling air. The mechanics of the midnight swap rested upon a chillingly simple deception. As the candlelight flickered across the heavy mahogany banquet table, attention was deliberately diverted by a sudden, staged commotion near the service pantry. In that fleeting second of universal distraction, the glass containing the sedated vintage was quietly lifted from its resting place and shifted directly into Julian Vance's line of sight. The blackmailer, focused entirely on the unfolding financial ultimatums and unaware of the lethal adjustment, reached out and took a steady sip from the wrong goblet. Detective Arthur Sterling reconstructed the sequence from the physical positioning of the tableware and the residual liquid droplet patterns discovered on the linen. The person who executed the switch did not need brute force or complex machinery. They simply relied on the perfect timing of the room's collective anxiety. Every guest at the table was watching Julian's face, waiting for the devastating disclosure of the corporate ledger, completely blind to the quiet exchange happening inches away from their plates. Yet, this precise orchestration left behind an undeniable trail of physical evidence, a subtle misalignment of the crystal bases and a faint smudge of condensation on the foreign glass rim. As the timeline locked into place, the identity of the person who moved the goblet stood revealed through the unique cashmere fiber left beneath the victim's fingernail during that desperate final struggle. But a massive question remained unresolved at the heart of the investigation, waiting in the shadows of the pre-dawn quiet. The physical evidence pointed straight toward the core of the retreat, but the digital battleground shifted into the server room. Just as Detective Arthur Sterling confronted the primary suspect with the undeniable cashmere fiber recovered from the victim's hand, a sudden surge echoed through the administrative terminal array. The private server housing the master copies of Julian Vance's blackmail files began cycling through a rapid, automated deletion sequence. Someone was attempting to wipe the entire financial architecture clean before the authorities could mirror the hard drives. The firewall logs revealed an override command executed from a secondary terminal on the lower floor, a terminal restricted exclusively to administrative overrides. The investigation narrowed instantly to a desperate race against time. The physical murder weapon and the glass swap were meticulously planned, but this digital purge exposed an accomplice working in the shadows to finish what the poison started. As the cooling fans whined in the server enclosure, Sterling rushed down the dimly lit corridor, knowing that if the encrypted databases vanished, the true motive behind the midnight feast would remain buried forever. The evidence no longer pointed merely to a single vengeful guest, but to a deeply coordinated conspiracy designed to destroy the very records that proved who stood to gain the most from Julian Vance's silence. Marcus Thorne sat across the interrogation table, his composure finally fracturing under the crushing weight of the physical evidence. The actual intended target of that poisoned glass was never Julian Vance at all, but Marcus himself, who had received a ruthless ultimatum demanding his entire corporate portfolio. Marcus had anticipated the move, intercepting the Cellar vintage and executing the swap in plain sight during the deliberate distraction near the pantry. Regarding the missing ledger, the hidden management document remained securely locked inside the retreat founder's private vault, recovered by Detective Arthur Sterling just moments before the automated server purge wiped the digital drives clean. Every loose thread finally pulled taut. The unlisted wine glass, the rare cashmere fiber left beneath Julian's fingernail, and the breached administrative door all pointed directly to the calculated duel between the blackmailer and the financier. As Marcus realized that his meticulously planned defense had completely collapsed, the full truth of the midnight feast settled into the cold pre-dawn silence. The trap had closed, turning the blackmailer's own venom back against his intended victim, and sealing a fate forged in years of calculated greed. Marcus Thorne sat across the interrogation table, his composure finally fracturing under the crushing weight of the physical evidence. The actual intended target of that poisoned glass was never Julian Vance at all, but Marcus himself, who had received a ruthless ultimatum demanding his entire corporate portfolio. Marcus had anticipated the move, intercepting the Cellar vintage and executing the swap in plain sight during the deliberate distraction near the pantry. Regarding the missing ledger, the hidden management document remained securely locked inside the retreat founder's private vault, recovered by Detective Arthur Sterling just moments before the automated server purge wiped the digital drives clean. Every loose thread finally pulled taut. The unlisted wine glass, the rare cashmere fiber left beneath Julian's fingernail, and the breached administrative door all pointed directly to the calculated duel between the blackmailer and the financier. As Marcus realized that his meticulously planned defense had completely collapsed, the full truth of the midnight feast settled into the cold pre-dawn silence. The trap had closed, turning the blackmailer's own venom back against his intended victim, and sealing a fate forged in years of calculated greed. The elite wellness retreat closed its grand iron gates permanently shortly after that midnight feast, leaving behind only the cold echoes of buried corporate secrets and broken promises. The authorities dismantled the labyrinth of financial extortion, ensuring that Julian Vance's hidden ledger finally saw the light of day. Yet, amidst the sterile forensic reports and the quiet removal of evidence, one small human detail remained etched in memory: the old half-chewed peppermint candy left untouched in the dead blackmailer's left coat pocket. It was a humble, pathetic reminder of ordinary human anxiety, clinging to a man who believed he was invincible. The lethal game he engineered ultimately consumed him, turning his own trap back upon his head through the calculated precision of a threatened survivor. Justice arrived not through blind vengeance, but through the unrelenting logic of physical evidence and human motive. As the cold pre-dawn wind swept across the empty gravel courtyards, the shadows of the past finally settled into permanent silence. Thank you for listening to this dark chapter of human ambition. If you appreciate these deep forensic explorations into the labyrinth of true crime, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.